Welcome to the SDG Warriors podcast. In today's episode, we'll be in conversation with Mr. Paul Sokoloff. Mr. Paul is a senior research assistant in Botany and a member of the Arctic Flora of Canada and Alaska project. His work boils down to cataloging plant and lichen biodiversity in the Arctic and beyond. On any given day, Mr. Paul may be in a faraway place doing fieldwork in the museum's herbarium studying specimens or taking part in outreach activities on behalf of the museum. Mr. Sokoloff first came to the Canadian Museum of Nature as a master's student under the supervision of a research scientist. He determined that the Fernald's milkvetch is not a plant species of its own. 2 days after submitting his thesis, he was on a plane bound for Victoria Island in the Western Canadian Arctic as a museum field assistant, and he hasn't looked back since. Since then, Mr. Paul has embarked on 9 Arctic expeditions with the museum and has participated in multiple biological expeditions at the Mars Desert Research Station. And today, he works as a botanist, Mars analog researcher, and a science communicator. We are so honored to have you today on our show, Mr. Paul.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, before we get into the conversation, to help our audience to audibly visualize the whole conversation, can you tell us where are you right now? What is the weather like outside? And what can you see from your window right now?
Oh, that's a great question. So I am based out of Ottawa in Canada. It's the nation's capital. And it also happens to be the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, who are the indigenous people that are native to this land. And it's my privilege to be able to live and work on this land. And here it is 9 in the morning, and outside of my window, the sun is coming up and the trees are so green, and it rained last night, so everything is just glistening and lovely.
Wow, we can so resonate over here living in Bangalore. In Bangalore, it is 34 degrees Celsius and it is a very windy and cloudy day. It has been raining for many days and therefore it is very chilly as well. So let's begin with the questions. Well, so we wanted to know that what is a typical day in Paul Sokoloff look like, and can you please describe it to us?
Well, that's a great question, and it really depends on the day. So I work at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and we're an organization that does natural history research all across Canada. And so, we have folks who are interested in minerals and fossils, but I'm a botanist, so I love to talk about plants. And I feel really privileged to be able to spend all of my days working on plants in different ways. And so, a typical day, for me, it always starts off with coffee because I like coffee to start my mornings. And then often it will be, a combination of looking at plants in the herbarium. And our herbarium is essentially a pressed and dried collection of plants that we use to answer questions about what species grow where. Working with the herbarium, sometimes I'll work on databases that involve the herbarium. Sometimes it'll be working on manuscripts, so scientific publications that talk a little bit about plant biodiversity. I'm also, because I work at a museum, we get to have a lot of fun communicating with the public as well. So writing things like blog posts, working on gallery exhibits. It's so variable from day to day, and that's something I really love about my job.
Wow, your day is so interesting. What is your current job profile, and can you please explain it to us like you would to a 10-year-old?
Absolutely. So I mentioned I work at the Museum of Nature, and my job title there is a senior research assistant in the Botany division. And so what I get to do is I work with a large team of scientists, of collections professionals, so people who take care of our collections, the pressed and dried plants, people who curate them, people who work in archives, so finding information that helps us do our research. And all of that, it goes back to that initial kind of thing that I was mentioning was what we're trying to do, or what I'm working with our team trying to do, is we're trying to figure out what plants grow where. And in particular, we're working in the Arctic. And so in Canada and across the Northern Hemisphere, above the Arctic Circle and above the tree line where trees don't grow, there are so many different kinds of interesting plants and lichens. And what we're trying to do is figure out, okay, how many different species are there? And that's and we do that by collecting and by studying those preserved specimens.
Right. How did this interest of yours begin in plants, and do you have any memories from your childhood that led to this passion?
Oh, absolutely. So I was born originally in St. John's in Newfoundland and Labrador here in Canada. But when I was growing up, my family actually moved around the world. So I spent a few years living in Jakarta, Indonesia, and a few years living in Vung Tau, Vietnam. And when we were in those areas, we would always go back to Singapore, actually. And at Singapore, my family would always take me to the botanical gardens, or we would go to the botanical gardens, or we'd go to, there's a resort called Sentosa, which is just off the coast of Singapore. And just the plants there were so cool. And I have really vivid memories of, at a young age, being surrounded by these lush plants. And, you know, we would go gardening. When we did eventually move back to Canada, and we would garden in our yard. And I think and we would always spend time outdoors. We would try to go camping, and we would go on hikes. And I think all of those really kind of set me on this path of wanting to know more about plants, and wanting to have a career that let me do that.
Right, back here in Bangalore as well, we have a very, very famous botanical garden, which is the Lal Bagh Botanical Garden. So whenever we want to know more about plants, and we want to explore the beauty of nature and the colorful flowers and be next to nature, we always go to the Lal Bagh Botanical Garden. And we have also heard that you explore a lot about the Arctic. And we also know that ice is a time machine. So as a botanist, what stories can ice sheets and glaciers tell us about our past?
Oh, absolutely. So, lots of folks study ice cores. And so what they essentially do is they, as you mentioned, ice can be a time machine. So they drill down into the ice, and they can figure out, okay, well, what was the atmosphere like? Because it preserves the composition of the atmosphere. And so this lets us talk a little bit more about the deep past in terms of how climate changes. But for the plants in particular, one of the most interesting things about the ice ages is they've actually shaped where plant habitats are. Because there were large ice sheets covering many parts of the Arctic, it kind of scoured the landscape. And so plants only were able to reestablish after the ice age. And, we can actually track where plants came from by looking at their genome. We can figure out, okay, we'll sequence DNA from a plant species across the Arctic, and we're looking at how diverse that DNA is. And if we find, if we find a particular area in the Arctic that has a lot of diversity in its genome, then we actually think that might be a refugia, or a place where it wasn't glaciated. And so plants started there and then spread out from there. So ice and plants, ice shaped where plants grow and continues to shape the landscape in the Arctic.
Well, that's actually quite interesting to hear. And wow, tracking how plants came from the ice age and shaped the future right now, and talking about these plants, how they evoluted from the ice age, and tracking how the climate changes over the years. That's so interesting to hear about. We would also like to know that as an expert, how do you foresee the Arctic by 2030? And given the impact of climate change, is our future really bright?
Well, I think it's really important to keep in mind that we do see climate changing, but we have the power to make choices that will help us. And, in the Arctic, one of the things that folks are seeing, and one thing about the Canadian Arctic and the circumpolar Arctic is that many folks have heard the stories about it being a place to explore. Not many folks have heard that it's actually been a homeland for thousands of years to Inuit. And so in Canada, it's called Inuit Nunangat, the Inuit homeland. And that's 4 different settlement regions. So we have Nunatsiavut, Nunavik in northern Quebec, Nunavut, Canada's newest territory, established in 1999, and the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Northwest Territories. And it's been inhabited for so long that folks who have lived there their entire lives are seeing changes. So when we work with communities, elders will often tell us about places where plants might be growing a little more lush than they used to, or especially in the northwestern part of Canada on the coast of the Beaufort Sea. Folks have been showing us coastal erosion that's happening, where permafrost is essentially thawing out, and as a result, the entire coastline is starting to fall into the sea. And these have tremendous impacts on these communities. And these communities are on the front line of climate change, but they're not, some of the biggest emitters of carbon. And so it's really important to remember that anything we do affects the globe. It's not just any one, it's just not any one person. We have to make collective better choices. And so, to answer your question, what is the Arctic going to look like in 2030? I think that some species will do really well, because, some species might, find ways to adapt. Some species are not going to do well, and it's really important for us to try to mitigate climate change, because biodiversity is so important. We don't want those species to be in an area where they can't adapt to such a rapidly changing climate. And one thing that we can all do together is we can all call for action on climate, and that's something that's really important to do.
Right. Climate change is not only affecting us as a community in a particular region, but it's affecting the whole world. The indigenous people have been protecting the environment, and their stories capture the way that the world is changing because of development. It is really important to be the change and take the action right now. And the worst thing that we could do is to expect someone else to do that. You yourself need to be the change, and be the change that you wish to see in the world. Right, that was about planet Earth. Now we would like to go and explore Mars, and we all love the Martians' attempts at growing potatoes on Mars. What would agriculture on Mars look like? We were curious.
Okay, well that's a really good question, and I'm a botanist who primarily works on Earth because there are currently no plants on Mars. But I do like to I actually like to understand what Mars might be like, because I've always been interested in space and stars. And so actually I work occasionally with a group called the Mars Society, and they have a station in Southeast Utah called the Mars Desert Research Station, where they work to study what it might be like to live and work on another planet. And I think we're a very long way off from growing agriculture, having agriculture on Mars. And there are a few reasons for that. We don't have soil on Mars. Instead, we have what's called regolith, which is just essentially pulverized rocks and dust on the surface of Mars. And actually, this regolith contains all sorts of toxic chemicals called perchlorates, which we would have to remove from it in order to grow any sort of food. And then if you remember the Martian, he had to add fertilizer in order to get the soil going. So we'd have to do that. So, when we go, and, I do hope that we go one day to explore another planet, and I hope that it's more for learning more about it. I think going for science is the most important reason to go. I think we'll probably end up, it's most efficient to just bring all the food that we need with us when we go. And, if we do end up growing things on Mars, then hydroponics is likely going to be the way to do that. And actually, we're growing hydroponic lettuce right now on the International Space Station.
Wow, growing lettuce in the International Space Station. That's something new that we didn't know about. And you just mentioned that the traditional agriculture might not be the best way to grow plants on Mars. So, in your opinion, if we do start colonizing on Mars, what would be our food source then?
Oh, that's a great question. I suspect it will be almost entirely plant-based, because it will just be unfortunately, animal husbandry is just not going to be possible in the confines that you'd see there. And some folks are actually exploring insect protein as a potential food source if we're exploring other worlds. And I think all of those things assume one key important fact, and that's that Earth is going to have a healthy biosphere that can help sustain these missions of science. And so, there's been a lot of talk about, we have to colonize Mars in order to have another planet. And I think that it's really important to go to other worlds, but I also think it's really important to take care of this one too, because this is still such a good world. And I don't think it's either or. Space science provides us so many interesting innovations for our life. But it's also important to remember that we have a cool planet here too.
Absolutely. There's a quote and a saying about the sustainable development goals that we should take action and be the change, because we have only a planet A and there's no planet B right now. So we should protect our planet Earth. We should do all these wonderful things and research more about planet Earth before going ahead and learning more about the other planets. So we can learn about them, but then we should take action and protect our planet before we go ahead and protect other planets. So we would also like to know that from your research, which plant is the best suited plant to survive and flourish on Mars?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I haven't done this research myself. This is research done by other folks. But plants that grow quickly in hydroponic conditions seem to be well. So lettuce does really well in hydroponic conditions. Radishes and strawberries. Strawberries seem to do quite well in those conditions. This is unfortunately nobody's tried coffee yet. But mint also grows quite well. So at least maybe we could have mint tea and hops. So actually, one of the ingredients in beer seems to grow really well in Martian soil simulants. And so, we'll have a few different things to sustain us if we do want to go.
Right, growing lettuce, mint, and other plants, that would be a possible solution to eat in Mars. But I have a question that would they actually taste the same like it does on Earth?
That's a great question. So there's been some research that gravity affects your sense of taste. And so, astronauts on the space station, they don't necessarily taste things the same way that we do. And this is because, your tongue is an organ, just like any other part of your body. And so in lower gravity, blood flow is going to be different, and the way that liquids interact with your tongue is going to be different. And so you might not taste them in the same way. So it might taste a little different. And, I'm not speaking from personal experience, although if somebody said, hey, do you want to go eat something in space? I would absolutely be there in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. We would love to have a hamburger or a lettuce sandwich in Mars. So now we know that your research requires you to work in two of the most remotest areas of Earth, the Arctic and the Mars Desert Research Station. So we wanted to know that how do you prepare yourself physically and especially emotionally for these long periods of isolation when you're separated from friends and family?
That's a really important fact to consider. We think about fieldwork as, okay, you need to be fit and you need to be able to carry things and walk. But your emotional health is so important to that as well. And I'm really happy you brought that up. So, one thing that I do like to do is walk a lot. And that's, the nice thing about being a botanist is we end up walking a lot, but very slowly because we're walking looking at the ground most of the time. So we don't have to go very fast. But we, other things that we do that are important to us are maintaining connection with friends and family. And actually, we we might not hear from folks for a while. So, but we do have devices that let us send text messages off of satellites. And so, we get to text each other occasionally, or we can call each other on the satellite phone. One of my favorite things is my husband, actually, when we go up, he sends us the news to our device, but he sends the news that he curates. So it's not always like the top stories, it's what he thinks is interesting. And it's always a nice thing to see. But another really important aspect to that is, we have to have a team that works well together. And so making sure that we're checking in with each other, making sure that all of our needs are met, that's so important to making sure that we get the best work done possible.
Absolutely. Technology is a savior in your case, and even during the pandemic. And also teamwork, like you mentioned, having good friends and family who care about you. That's absolutely very essential when you go ahead and research in these remote areas. Now, we also know that you research in remote locations, and that requires communication and collaboration with the locals. So how do you build that rapport and win the support of the indigenous people in the Arctic?
That's so important. And to be honest, I think a lot of scientists have really fallen short in past efforts. And sometimes, we don't always get it right. What's really important is that we involve communities as we're developing our research, and then we make sure to maintain a connection with communities. And so you don't want to be what we call a helicopter scientist, which is you just come in, take the research and leave, and you're never seen again, because honestly, it doesn't work, and it doesn't feel great either. So one of the things that we do is we work with the territorial government where we're working. So, often that's the government in Nunavut, to essentially work with communities to say, okay, what are you most interested in? And often we're working with Nunavut Parks, which is an agency looking to preserve areas in Nunavut that communities are interested in preserving. And then part of that is keeping in touch over the long term. And so going onto Facebook and seeing how folks are doing, or, making sure that when you do publish something that you send it back to the community. And when we're in the community, chatting with everyone that we can meet. And, if folks have questions, being open to chatting with them about what we're doing. And then working, with community members who might want to tell us a little bit more is so important. So making sure that we're engaged through the whole process is the key there, in my opinion.
Having that human connection with the community is very important, and nurturing and building those relationships with the community is an essential part of research, like you mentioned. Well, sir, you champion diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we wanted to know that, have you experienced bias in the academic context?
I've been very fortunate, I mentioned I have a husband earlier, and so something that's really important to me is and increasingly so is to be visible as an openly queer man in science, so that folks can see that. Because one thing that we often think about are you kind of wish it's important to be the person that you wish you saw when you were a kid. So that you can aspire to that. And so for me, it's really important to live authentically and to be my true self at work. But not only because that is part of who I am, I can't leave that at home when I go to the office, but also because it's important for others to see that. But then in other ways, it's really important for me to recognize that I am a white man. And, I have a certain amount of privilege in there that, I can hide my sexuality. And so it's not always the same thing. So, it's important for us to remember that, okay, yes, I need to champion queer causes in my science because that's important to me. But for my friends and my colleagues from all different backgrounds, it's so important to champion all areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion, because, without everyone being able to bring their true selves into science, it's not the same. And we need to be better as a discipline. You know, we need to be better at inclusion, and not just inclusion, but celebration of what everyone brings to science.
You mentioned respecting and celebrating people who belong to the global community. Each one is an ambassador of what we champion and what we represent. And I remember having a conversation with one of the guests where she widened my horizons about an answer that I had written in my exam paper, which was that this world is just like a beautiful painting where each one of us represents a different stroke, a different tint, a different kind of shade of a color. And when all of them come together and combine into a single painting, we see something that we all admire. And that is very similar to the earth that we have today. A world which is full of beauty, a world which is full of diversity, inclusion and equity. That is what planet Earth looks like from my eyes. And right now, I can resonate with your thoughts, like you mentioned, about being an ambassador and championing and representing your cause, being yourself, wherever you go, wherever you are in science, in your family, and next to your friends as well. So thank you so much for sharing that, sir. Sir, we would also like to know that do you feel being LGBT has affected your career decisions?
You know, it's an interesting question. I think I would have always ended up in botany because, you know, I mentioned that that's something that I've always been interested in. And, you know, I've been really fortunate in that botany is actually pretty accepting as a discipline. You know, there are tradition of, there are many queer folks who call it their science. We still have a long way to go in many ways in science. And not just, you know, for all members of our queer community. So for non-binary and trans folks, it's really important to make science as accepting as possible a place for them. And for Black scientists, Indigenous scientists, scientists of color, it's so important for us to work to remember that, you know, no one gets left behind. We all have to, and we all have a role to play in making spaces safer for everyone. I definitely feel that I feel very privileged to work in a discipline like botany where, you know, people were just like, oh, okay, cool.
Well, your love for botany guides our passion, and like you mentioned, there's also a sustainable development goal, reduce inequalities, when we need to work together to reduce all the inequalities of the world, where we progress together as a community and leave no one behind for achieving Agenda 2030. Right. So, what do you consider are the most pressing problems for scientists who belong to the LGBT community?
You know, I think right now, one of the biggest issues that I'm seeing within the queer community is that we're seeing, particularly for trans and Black and Indigenous members of our community, we're seeing a lot more criminalization and a lot more, in some jurisdictions, you know, restriction of freedoms. And so that's so important for us to fight against. And then there are so many little things that we can do to make it inclusive, but then there are so many bigger things that we can do. And I think one of those biggest things that we can do is political action. I think by you know, saying that this is not okay, by being out there and by using our power to make the world better for folks, that's one of the most important things amongst many so critical things that we need to be doing right now.
World is diverse, where everyone is unique, and we need to start conversations and raise our voice to address all these indifferences that people have created. And this is such a bad thing that we get to hear in today's communities, and we are so very proud of all the scientists who have made a difference into making this world a better place for everyone to live. So we wanted to know that, did you have any role models while growing up? So these can be any queer scientists related to STEM or totally unrelated.
There are always so many role models. One role model of mine now is actually, I mentioned him in a presentation I gave earlier this week, was Rupert Barnaby, who was a queer scientist who was completely self-taught, and he learned about Astragalus, which is the genus I study, the milkvetches. And he essentially came, he went from England to America with his partner in the 1950s, and they were just who they were. And so I find his story particularly inspiring. And sometimes, like, I'm not going to lie, sometimes fictional characters can be a bit inspiring too, right? What the world that we see. And so I'm a huge science fiction fan, and growing up, I watched a lot of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and Keiko O'Brien was a botanist, and I always wanted to know more about what she did. And so, I've got fictional role models as well. And then, as I continue to go on my scientific journey, I meet so many fantastic people who are doing the most that they can to make positive change. And so all of those folks continue to inspire me every day. And that's, it's so nice to be able to work with friends who continue to show you better ways of doing things.
People in our community, our families and our friends, and also people who are making a difference to this world, and also fictional characters, they truly make our life full and they truly inspire us a lot. So, from your adventures so far, what have been your biggest learnings?
My biggest learning is that it never stops. I think that it's always important to listen. There's an old proverb about listening twice as much as you speak. And I'm an extrovert, so I like to chat a lot. So I try to keep that in mind, but listening to other folks and always, like, sometimes it's just, listening when people are volunteering information about themselves, or saying how something affected them, or how we can do better as a discipline, as a community. That's probably the number one thing I've learned, is that the learning never stops.
Wow, the learning never stops, and all of us are lifelong learners. Listening is a lost art, and that is something that we should totally get back in today's world. So, what is a piece of work that you are very, very proud of? And can you please share the story, what makes it unique?
Actually, I think some of the work that I'm the most proud of are a few papers that I wrote about working at the Mars Desert Research Station, and it was about the plant diversity that are at those places. And I think for me, the reason I'm so proud of them is because they represent just these. It was nice to be able to go and to do the science, and then to carry it all the way to publication, and to work with a great group of people while doing it. So I think I'm really proud of those. They're in a way, they're kind of like my babies, because I started that program with my friend and colleague, Dr. Shannon Rupert, who's the director of the Mars Desert Research Station. She has been such a champion for biodiversity studies in that area, and I am so happy that she wanted to go on this journey with us. So I think those are the ones I'm most proud of, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. To keep the momentum going, we come on to the rapid fire round. So are you ready, Mr. Paul?
I am set. Thank you.
Right. The first question, what are the best parts of your job?
I really love field work. Just being able to be in these places with these plants are great. But then the second best part of my job is identifying them, and actually bringing them to the lab and looking under the microscope, and using the key to figure out what plant it is. I find that fascinating. I find it frustrating from time to time, but if you're not occasionally frustrated at it, you're not having as much fun as you can be.
Absolutely. We would also like to know, what are the worst parts of your job?
I think sometimes it can, when you're waiting for like an answer about fieldwork, or if you're in an airport waiting for the plane to come because the weather is taking a turn for the worse and it hasn't come, that can be a little frustrating. And then, I love a good Excel worksheet, but sometimes Excel doesn't behave, and so those are frustrating moments.
Right. We all have students have experienced that a lot this year. So we can resonate with your thoughts right now. So we would also like to know, what has been your most scariest moment in life?
There are moments. There are moments of fear and fascination. Does that make sense? When I was a kid, I actually was involved in an accident, and it was scary for my parents, but I got better. It was fine, and so I think that was scary for them more than it was for me. But I think, I mentioned fear and fascination. A couple of years ago, I was working on Ellesmere Island in Nunavut, and I went to bed, and it was the midnight sun, so the sun was circling overhead, and about at 1 a.m, a white animal stuck its head into my tent, and I don't think I moved as fast as I did at that moment to the back of my tent, and I was so relieved when I saw it was just a wolf, and just a curious wolf, because you don't want to have wildlife interactions if you can avoid it, and so I think for those that like half a second of like what is happening, that probably was like the most amount of adrenaline I've ever experienced.
So you were so brave at that point of time. If I was in your place, I would have directly run back home. No matter what, nothing can stop me from there. So, sir, we would also like to know that if you could be a superhero, and you could be a superhero in the world of fiction, who would it be and why? And which superpower would you like to have?
Oh, that's a really good question. I've actually never thought about it. I gotta think about that. Is there an environmental superhero? There must be. Captain Planet. There's a cartoon from the early 90s where he could be summoned by a group of teenagers who were from around the world to help with the environment. And so, he could like green things, he could get rid of pollution. Maybe Captain Planet.
Wow. I wasn't born then, back in the 90s, but then surely we would love to revisit Captain Planet's tales and adventures. So, if you could choose a theme song or a background music that could play in the background of your life for the rest of your life, what would it be?
I like classical music, and so I think one of my favorite pieces is the Scheherazade Suite by Rimsky-Korsakov, and I love the way it flows and ebbs, and I think that's something I could listen to forever.
Well, we would add that to the SDG Warriors playlist, and we will surely listen to it, sir. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Paul. As we near the end of our episode, we come on to the most important questions, which will have huge takeaways for our audience. The first one being, who or what has been your biggest inspiration in life?
I'm most inspired when I see communities coming together in common cause. And so seeing communities come together to protect the environment and their environment has been so inspiring to see. Seeing groups of folks come together to make their towns or their communities a better place is so important. One example is communities working together to establish protected areas in the Arctic, and to say, we don't want destructive practices like fracking happening in areas, and seismic testing in areas like Clyde River. Seeing communities say, no, this is not okay, and come together. Those are some of the most inspiring things I've seen. And then seeing people be their most true, authentic selves and actually have hard conversations about, how science is not working for them because of their background or how they were excluded from science. That bravery is so important to see, and it's important for us then to make sure that they aren't just speaking into a vacuum, that when they're saying it's not working, okay, we have to change.
It takes a lot of courage to bring such things up. And sir, you truly are a role model. Like you said, that the unity of the people to tackle today's issues is the most inspiring thing that you have seen today. That's one of the most unique answers that we have got in our podcast. What advice would you give to students who want to become like you?
You know, I think it's really important to pursue what you want to do, because I think passion helps drive you when things get frustrated and when things aren't going quite according to plan. And also it's so important to have, you know, going through science and going through life can be challenging, right? Having a core group of friends and family who raise you up, and you know, finding those people. When you find those people, keeping those relationships going and close, that's so important. So I would say finding your community and finding people who will at any point just celebrate who you are. That's the most important thing that can help you in any career you choose, especially in science.
So in science, following your passion and finding your tribe and having those family and friends who make you better every single day and who build and sustain your life and your relationships. That's the most important thing that we require today. Thank you so much for such a big takeaway, sir. So, as a Nat Geo explorer, what are the top skills and attitudes that students have to develop in their schooling years?
Oh, okay. So absolutely a sense of observation, about being able to observe the world around you, because being able to look around and say, oh, that I need to go take a closer look at is an important skill in science, but also just in being aware of the changing world around us. And you know, one thing that I think is so important is empathy. Fostering that skill of being able to see where your colleagues are coming from, or where community members are coming from, and being open to change based on that. You know, we think of science as this you know, great kind of like, often there's this stereotype that science is just about the research, but science, like anything else, is about human connection. It's a human endeavor because we do it. And so having those skills to just listen to the other person and put yourself into their shoes as much as you can, knowing you're not always going to understand somebody's lived experiences, but making space for them to talk about their life and talk about their challenges, and then figuring out, okay, well, how can I make them the center of how I'm going to move forward is so important.
Absolutely, sir. Finding solutions to people's problems and finding out what problems that they are facing, so that when we find those solutions, it can not only impact that single person, but also the community as a whole who have not spoken out yet. But if we solve their problem and they hear about that solution, they can solve their own problem as well, and it can create a more positive community as a whole. Thank you so much, sir, for being a part of the SDG Warriors podcast. You're a role model for all of us back here in India, and we would love to connect with you in the future as well. A brave botanist who is the helm of cutting edge science, who treasures the human connections and empathy, and also celebrates justice, equity, and diversity. Thank you so much, sir, for being a part of our podcast, and it was truly, truly an honor to be in this conversation with you, sir.
The honor is all mine, Samara. It was so great to chat with you today. Thank you so much for having me.